IIT alumni and their families joining from Singapore and in India. We have registrants from Australia, Japan, across the ASEAN countries, Middle East, and I believe even from UK. So there have been lots of interest from many different walks of life. And the IIT Alumni Association is happy to have everyone join and learn about the Indian scientific heritage. We are thankful to our gold sponsors, ICICI Bank and Optimum Solutions, our silver sponsors, SDFC, Hugs Epigram, Strategile, and Agrud. Without their support, this and other events of the IIT Alumni Association would not be possible. One important request, please type in your questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom box. We have shared with you a brief profile of the author Ganesh Swaminathan when you registered. So I will not repeat it verbatim. He is my senior from IIT Delhi. We recently got connected and realized we have lots of common friends from his career in HP and outside too. So let me welcome our guest, Ganesh Swaminathan, the author of From the Beginning of Time, Modern Science and Puranic Universe. Ganesh, welcome to the IIT-ian event.
Thank you very much, Venkat. Thank you very much. First off, thank you very much for taking time off on your weekend to have this interview with me. And I'd like to thank the IIT Alumni Association of Singapore for offering their platform for us to share this interview with a lot of our friends and family. So thank you very much, I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure, Ganesh. Weekend or a Saturday afternoon is nothing. I admire you for taking out 8 years of your life to study the Puranas. I mean, even for IIT, you took only 5 years, right? And then 2 years to write this book. You know, for me and many people that I know, Amar Chitrakatha was our only source of everything wise and wonderful about Indian heritage.
That's true.
Right? So hats off to you for your labor of love to do a comparative study of the Puranas, modern astronomy, astrogeology, etc.
Thank you. Yeah.
I definitely recommend the book to you all viewers. Ganesh's book will be available in Singapore through our sponsors Hugs Epigram at their cafe and bookstore at the URA building. And I understand in India, you can order it via Amazon. And I guess it's available in other parts of the world also via Amazon. Ganesh, is it open?
That's true. It's listed in the US, UK, Germany, and Australia, and Singapore, obviously.
Awesome. Awesome. So I read your fascinating book, From the Beginning of Time, Modern Science and the Puranic Universe. So I strongly felt that you should share with the viewers today about your research and some interesting parts of your book. So okay. Ganesh, how did it all start for you? And, you know, give us a flavor of what readers can expect from the book.
So wonderful question. So I think it's not a very intuitive book. Just like what you said, it's not something that, it's not just the Amar Chitrakatha in a different format.
Right.
So what I did was I put together a very short presentation on the book, and let me go ahead and share my screen, and it'll give a lot of the viewers who are not familiar with the book a sense of some context of what we're planning to discuss in the next short few minutes.
Sure.
Here we go. So can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So the book is titled From the Beginning of Time, and when we think of the Puranas, we think of religious shlokas, we think of stories of religious merit, we think of stories of moral value, but very seldom do we think of science itself. So let me introduce the topic to you very briefly. The first thing that I want to share with you is about Puranas and the nature of scientific inquiry. So the Puranas say that the scriptures are one of the 4 sources of knowledge, and the other 3 being inference, perception, and reasoning. And they say they should be tested before acceptance. So not very, it doesn't jump off the page to you. So let me walk you through the verse. It says, the learned men should comprehend and retain in belief by means of scripture, inference, perception, and reasoning after testing intelligently and carefully. So you can see the name of the Purana is here, the book of the Purana is here, the section, chapter, and the verse number. So anybody that wants to go back and understand this a little more has the option to do so. But I thought this was an amazing proposition for a text that we consider canon. So most texts that are canonical rely on unquestioning faith for their acceptance, right? And here is a text that says that, it says two things. It says the scriptures are one of the sources of knowledge, not the only source of knowledge. And the second thing, it says that everything, including the scripture, should be tested before acceptance. And so I thought that was a very profound remark about the nature of knowledge itself as the Puranas view it. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was that it parallels the scientific method. So many of us will be familiar with the scientific method. It basically consists of 3 steps or 3 steps or 4 steps. You have a hypothesis based on which has a few predictions. Then you test those predictions with either by gathering evidence or by running an experiment. And only if the experiments and the gathering of evidence matches the hypothesis or the prediction, do you accept it, right? So that's the scientific method that has served us for the past few centuries. And it's basically evidence-based. It's not faith-based, right? And here is the Puranas that talks about the same scientific method in a very elegant verse, a couple of thousand years ago, right? So it's not just that it is aligned to, but it's actually prescribing the scientific method that we use today for the adoption of knowledge. So I thought that was really interesting. So it kind of sets the stage for some of the aspects that are to follow. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 aspects. The first one is the units of length, evolution along with society. I'll talk to you about the Earth, and a feature of the Earth is the undersea volcanoes. And I'll talk to you about the Sun, which is the red giant phase of the Sun. Let's talk about the units of length. So the Puranas don't just list out the units of length, they talk about it in the context of the development of society. So if you look at man living in having a nomadic life, after his nomadic life, they first live in hamlets, so they in a collection of habitation huts or something, so that they can protect themselves from the weather, from wild animals, and so on, right? And then once agriculture takes place, then they organize themselves into a village. And then the next stage is a town, right? Where there is security, markets, political structures, it is a king, and so on and so forth. Everything comes together in a town. And the Purana says that initially the units during the stage of the hamlet were based on the human body, right? It says, after measuring with their own fingers in the beginning, they made thereafter other units for the sake of measurement, right? So, and thereafter you see the units. You have the Angula, the Pada, the Vitasti, the Hasta, and the Dhanu, and these are all body measures that have been used to establish units of measures of length. Right? So quite interesting. We go to the next unit of measure, which is the krosa, and the krosa is actually used even today in some of the rural areas, and it's called the kos, and it's 2,000 dhanu. Now, the Arthashastra actually defines the kosa, the dhanu, as the distance of a cow's moo, right? I thought it was a very fascinating description. And basically, it talks about a very agrarian, agricultural-centric definition, usage of the unit. And then we have town planning, right? And that's the next unit, which is 4 krosa, that's about 8,000 dhanu. And then for this, the Purana says, with the yojana as the unit of measurement, settlements, that is colonies, were made thereafter, right? So it talks about not just colonies, it talks about development of forts and fortresses and so on and so forth. And so the next larger unit of settled society was made. And what is interesting is that the word yojana in Sanskrit translates to plan, and so it fits into this concept of planned townships or planned habitations for a large society. So very fascinating insight that is offered in the Puranas on the development of the units of length. Let's go to the Earth, right? And the undersea volcanoes of the Earth. So the Earth and the Puranas are a text which are, about 2,000 years old, right? There are people that are dated between 500 BCE to 500 CE, right? So 500 AD. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but about 2,000 years old, let's just say, right? Most of the text from that time used to describe the Earth as being flat, right? So either flat and circular, or in some cases flat and square and surrounded by water. A very strange description. The Puranas describe not only the shape, the spherical shape, it describes the size, and it describes the geography of the Earth. So it describes the spherical with a circumference, and some specifics about mountains and rivers and other geographical features. Interestingly, they described the Americas long before they were discovered by the explorers that we have learned about earlier. But what I found interesting was that it describes the interior of the Earth as well, something that we have learned quite recently. So let me talk to you about that. So if you look at the structure of the Earth, it's basically composed of three parts: the core, the mantle, and the crust. And the crust is where we live on, right? It's thin, about 35 kilometers thickness, but it's very thin, especially at the ocean beds. It's about 3 to 4 kilometers thick, right? And below it, you have the mantle, which is basically rocks at very high temperature. And anytime there's a break in the crust, the mantle either oozes out as lava or as a volcanic eruption, one of these two things, basically. So the longest chain of mountains in the world is not the Andes or the Himalayas. It's actually a chain of volcanoes on the seabed, and it's about 40,000 kilometers long. It's called the Ring of Fire, and it's called the Circum-Pacific Belt because it's a belt around the Pacific Ocean, and you'll see it on a map in a couple of minutes. So the Puranas recognize a region of high temperature, the mantle beneath the ocean floor, and they are referred to in the translation submarine fire and called the Aurva, right? One of the verses describes what would happen to the Earth's crust if it's exposed to the mantle, right? And this is interestingly a conversation between Lord Shiva and Parvati, and Lord Shiva is explaining to Parvati what would happen in such a situation. And it says, then the ocean, the Lord of the rivers, get dried up on being drunk by Aurva, the submarine fire. So basically, what would happen is that if the Earth's crust cracked, then the waters would be in direct contact with the mantle, and they would evaporate. Right? There's sufficient evidence of this having happened in the past, and they would all dry up. And so this is an amazing amount of insight that a text of this age should have. Right? There's another verse again which says in the Brahmanda Purana, which says that it describes the Aurva as having the face of a mare. It says the submarine fire has the name Aurva, and it has the face of a mare. And so this is the Circum-Pacific Belt that I spoke to you earlier. And you can see the part next to South America is the hind legs of the mare. The part next to Australia looks like the forelegs. The northern Pacific is the body, and the snout is somewhere in the Southeast Asian region. So quite an astonishing correlation for a feature that we cannot see today, right? It's at the ocean floor beneath the oceans, and yet it's pretty clearly described. It's quite interesting. I'll go next to the sun, right? So we talked about the Earth, we talked about a concept, the unit of length, we talked about the Earth, which we live on, and this is about space. And this is about the sun and the red giant state of the sun. So a lot of you may not be familiar, but I will give a very quick primer to get you going. So the sun is one of the billions of low mass stars in the universe. It's the host star for our solar system, and it's the source of all the energy in the solar system, the primary generator of energy in the solar system. And it's in the core of the sun where the energy is generated through the process of nuclear fusion. Now that's the understanding by science today, right? And this is a region of very high temperature and pressure, a temperature getting into 10 million degrees Kelvin. and which enables the fusion to take place. And the shell that surrounds it is where the energy is transferred outwards through basically convection and radiation. So as per modern science, the life cycle of the sun can be broken up into 5 different phases. There's a birth of a star, birth of the sun, like a low mass star. Interestingly, it has a young star stage, right? It's interesting to note that even stars have a juvenile stage where they are extremely active and so on. There is the current mature stage, which is about 4.5 billion years old, and it's expected to continue for another 3 to 5 billion years. After which the sun transitions into what is called the red giant stage. And then it collapses to the white dwarf, which basically signals the death of the star, basically, right? So we will talk about just the red giant stage, and we'll go back the whole thing in a minute, but just very briefly. So in about 3 to 5 billion years from now, as I mentioned, what happens is that the hydrogen in the core gets exhausted. So all of the hydrogen in the core gets converted to helium, right, through fusion. So all the hydrogen atoms fuse and become helium. And now the sun can produce energy in 2 ways. The helium in the core can now fuse to form carbon. So helium with an atomic number 2 or 2 helium atoms with atomic number 2 can fuse to form 1 carbon atom of atomic number 4, right? And then in addition, the hydrogen in the shell can also fuse to form helium, right? Because there's a lot of heat that's already been generated. As a result of these 2 processes, what happens is that the sun grows enormously in size. And Venus and Mercury, quite surprisingly, get absorbed into the disk of the sun. So you can see in the schematic here, you see the red giant sun. And right next to it, you see the Earth and all the other planets. The Venus and Mercury are no longer seen. And this is not just an estimate, just a thought, right? It's not just modeling. There is actually some computer modeling that this is derived from. So as per current computer models, the surface of the red giant sun comes up very close to the Earth. And the Earth is literally burnt by the sun's heat. So it's so close to the Earth that it's expected to be so close to the Earth that it's literally burnt by the sun's heat. And not just the heat of the sun, but from the solar flares that come up from the surface of the sun. So they emerge from the surface of the sun and travel millions of kilometers into space, and they wrap themselves around the Earth and literally fry everything on the surface, right? And as a result, there is hot rock and lava on the Earth, and the mantle breaks through the Earth's crust, and it almost looks like the Earth will glow. And here is an artist's impression of the Earth next to a red giant sun. It is from Wikipedia. It's close to a red giant sun. It's from Wikipedia, and you can see the mantle glowing, and you can see probably and the rest of the Earth is absolutely bare. Obviously, there's nothing that can survive this kind of heat. So let's see what the Puranas have to say about it. The Purana, just like modern science is a term for this called the red giant sun, the Puranas have a term for this called, and they call the sun the Samvartaka Aditya. Samvartaka means destruction or annihilation, and Aditya is of course the sun. And so the verse goes, when the end of the Kalpa arrives, the sun of 7 rays assumes the form of Samvartaka Aditya, the sun of final annihilation, and burns down the 3 worlds. Right. So it's very clear what the sun is doing, and what the impact of the Earth is. What I want to emphasize is this is not just a stray verse. In the Brahmanda Purana, there is a passage of almost 25 verses. And I'm not going to tell you all the verses because it would take too much time. But I'm going to give you a sampler of these verses so that you can get a sense for the detail that's available. So initially, as the sun begins to grow in size, the Earth gets hotter, right? And as it gets hotter, you have a drought on the planet, right? And so it says, then a continued drought lasting for 100 years takes place. Living beings deficient in strength become dissolved and get mingled with the dust, right? And so it says, basically, it describes the beginning of the drought on the planet Earth. Then it goes ahead and says that the rivers and the oceans dry up. It says the sun of 7 rays that blazes in the sky, sucking up water, drinks up water from the great ocean. And then it says the soil and the rocks lose moisture. It says being burned by the brilliant flames, the earth, including mountains, rivers, and oceans, become bereft of moisture and visibility. And finally, the earth is described as glowing from the heat of the sun. It says, getting the fiery splendor transmitted to it, the entire universe slowly assumes the form of a huge block of iron and shines thus, right? So it describes as shining. And this is what we saw in the illustration a few slides back, and this is exactly aligned with modern science. So it's an amazing correlation. And it's not just the red giant sun, it's the next phase is the white dwarf phase, where all the water that has evaporated from the oceans is in the atmosphere starts to form huge clouds and rain. Going back, there is the birth of Martanda. The word Martanda is actually broken up of two words: Mrita, which means dead, and Anda, which is sphere, which means a star is born as a dead sphere of gas, because at that stage it is not emitting any heat or light. And then it describes this stage of a young star as the marriage of Samtana and the sun god Vivaswan, and the maturing of the sun god Vivaswan after his marriage to Samtana, right? Just like young people mature after marriage. The current mature stage of the sun is described in a nice story of the Surya Jayanti and the water cycle. So very good description there. So you can see that each of the 5 stages of the sun's life is very clearly mapped with either descriptions, as in the mature stage, the red giant or the white dwarf, or in stories and allegory in the birth or the life of a young star. So I thought this was a phenomenal correlation. Most of us don't even know that the sun has a life of 5 stages, and that's not the purpose of our life. We are doing other things. It's amazing that a 2,000-year-old text can map this out in such detail. So it doesn't just talk about the space and geosciences. It talks about the earth. Like I said, it not only talks about the geography of the earth, it talks about events in its past, such as the descent of Ganga. The descent of Ganga is actually the origin of the earth's waters. It's a fascinating story in itself. It talks about the Brahmanda, which is the Bhumandala and the Loka. And there's a very complex story of the sun, its origin, its disappearance, and its reappearance in the churning of the Kshiroda Sagar. Right? And it's given, a lot of this is discussed in the book in the beginning of time. But more importantly, the Puranas have a lot more than just cosmology. They discuss everything from the science of music to medicine, right? And so it's a veritable treasure of knowledge, and it is something that that's a part of the heritage of not just us Indians, but of mankind in terms of knowledge. In closing, I'd like to add a couple of things. First thing is the aspects of Puranas that are completely aligned with science, such as the life cycle of the sun, be treated as a part of the history of science, right? When these texts were translated about 50 years ago or 60 years ago, we didn't know about the life cycle of the sun to be able to make these correlations, right? And those that are similar to science but not identical, such as the origin of the moon. And the origin of the moon, we still don't know yet for sure. There are many hypotheses out there. What the Purana suggests could be one of the hypotheses that we test before accepting. And finally, what I'd like to add is that our ancient Indian texts are known for ritual and devotion. They are known for their exposition of the karma and the bhakti marga. The Indian text should also be known for knowledge, for the jnana marga, specifically for vijnana. Yeah. Thank you very much. And with that, I hope I've given our viewers a flavor of the book, Venkat, and I'll now hand it back to you for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thoroughly enjoyable. Got a great flavor. Good breadth. And having read the book, I know that there's much more details in the book, and a lot more that you cover in the book. So that was awesome to give a parallel, sort of a blow by blow parallel of here is what the Brahmanda Purana says, and here is what the modern scientific publications, astronomical journals, what are they talking about, and so on and so forth. Awesome presentation. My request to the audience before we move into our discussion phase is please type in your questions in the Q&A section below, right? And so meanwhile, I'll try to explore a little more so that you can know more about the book and Ganesh's research in the next segment. So let's dive into it, Ganesh. In your presentation and towards the end, you talked about like very long periods of time, referred to as yugas and kalpas, billions of years. So when and you brought it up in the context of describing the life of the sun. So in terms of measuring time, you mentioned in the book that Puranas also have a name for like a fifth of a millisecond on the one end, and these yugas and kalpas on the other end. Why were the ancient Indians fascinated with times at these scales? That was like sort of a thing that pops out of my mind when you're talking about this.
That's a very good question. Very good question. And long before I read the Puranas, I thought about this question. Like, why? So when we think of any text written 2000 years ago, we think of a very agricultural civilization, right? A civilization primarily centered on agriculture.
Right.
And you wonder why would anybody in an agricultural civilization need to count to a billion of anything, right? Specifically about time. So I just want to add one thing, Venkat. There's very little, even though the smaller units of times, the Tuti and the Lava are mentioned, there's very little discussion on them. The almost entire amount of discussion is in the larger units of time, such as the Yuga and the Kalpa. And so I used to think about it. Why would an agrarian civilization want to know about time in billions of years? What's the value to anybody? Right? And as I read the Puranas, it becomes obvious that the only natural cycle that we are familiar with today that requires billions of years is the life cycle of the sun. Right? That's the only thing. There's nothing else that of any knowledge that we can have that runs into billions of years. Now, how they found this knowledge of the life cycle of the sun, I actually have no idea. I just want to state that up front. But if you want to quantify and speak about it or have a discussion about it, you need the notion of a kalpa, which runs into 4.3 billion years. So that's the best answer I have for it. But it's a very, very valid question in terms of why would they have such large numbers?
Yeah, sun, the life cycle of the sun,
correct.
Easiest one that we can relate to. But I guess broadly speaking, the stars in general, right?
Correct.
Right. So you have spent last quite a few minutes, in your presentation, as well as in answering this question on pretty esoteric stuff. Let me bring you down to the earth. You say that pi, the constant which we used in school geometry, was described with 99% accuracy. Right? And you mentioned a book called Surya Siddhanta.
Right.
And you said that also even talks about the sunrise and sunsets across various continents, not just India. Come on, Ganesh.
Yeah.
Tell us, about what are these interesting things that you read and about the Surya Siddhanta? How old is this?
So the Surya Siddhanta, so let me back up a bit, right? So I was shocked when I first read this. I think I'm not just a scholar, I'm a reader, just like everybody else in the audience here. So when we grow up, when you're asked about, what is India's contribution to mathematics, they say, oh, well, India contributed 0. And there is very little else to know beyond it. So kind of you shake your head and move on, saying, okay, that must be quite valuable, right? Now, here is a text. So the Surya Siddhanta is a text that is contemporary to the Puranas. It's seen as contemporary, about 2,000 years old, without getting into the last century or so. So, and there is a verse in the Surya Siddhanta which talks about the earth. The Surya Siddhanta primarily talks about the earth and the stars, basically. The Surya is stars, and so it talks about cosmology and the size of the earth. There is a verse there which says, to compute the circumference of the earth, you take the diameter, multiply it by 10. Take the diameter, square it, multiply it by 10, and take the square root. And this thing just completely threw me off. So there is a text that is 2,000 years old that is talking about a square root, right? How on earth can that even be possible? So in terms of answering your question, if you take a square root of 10 and you compare it to the value of pi, which is 3.14159 and so on, it is a 99% plus approximation of that number. More importantly, how did this concept of a square root exist 2000 years ago? It doesn't add up to anything that we've learned in school or anything of that sort. And this is a word, right? It's a specific computation. There is no allegory or a story or a king or a queen or nothing of that sort. It's a very simple one sentence words. So and just to put it in context, right? Before this, we were aware of the Roman system of notation, which is, you have sticks. So just imagine you write a large number in the Roman system of notation, and you try and multiply two large numbers, and you can spend the rest of the week doing it, right? Assuming that there's an elegant way of doing it. I'm sure there is a way, but I can't even imagine how you do a square root of a Roman numeral. So it's not obvious to me. So not only does it describe the value of pi in a very, it's not like it's a revelation or something. It's a very ordinary verse that you come across, and that just says it very simply. And if you're not looking for it, you can miss it and say, yeah, you just said something right. But it talks about a square root. It talks about an accurate computation of the ratio of a diameter of a circle to the circumference of the circle. It just goes to show that we have not been sufficiently educated about the depth of mathematical knowledge that our ancients had. That's coming out as I'm reading more and more about this. I hope.
So great. And it was not only pi, right? You referred to another similarly named book called Siddhanta Shiromani, where you talk about verses from concept of gravity, right? Correct. So this is a different book, right?
That's a different. So maybe let me kind of back up again. So the Surya Siddhanta talks about a spherical Earth very clearly, right? There's no allegory or anything. It says that it talks about the circumference of the Earth, and it says that as a circle, and then it says that there are continents in 4 different corners of this circle. And when you have sunrise in one place, it's high noon in another place, and it's evening in the third place, and so on and so forth. It just describes the entire movement of the Earth. More importantly, it talks about the North Pole being north of all of these points, so just like you see on a spherical surface. So it talks about a sphere very clearly, very explicitly, right? There's no stories or no allegory or anything. Now, it's important to understand you can only have a notion of a sphere if you have a notion of gravity. Without that, people at the southern hemisphere will kind of fall off the planet, basically. And so the Surya Siddhanta is a very simple verse saying that people can stand on the Earth, on whichever part of the Earth they are, right? So it says very distinctly, and then it moves on. It doesn't describe it in any great detail. So the Surya Siddhanta also talks about gravity, and it talks about the spherical Earth. The Siddhanta Shiromani, which is about 300 years later, so long before Newton came up with the theory of gravity and the equations, it talks about the property of the Earth to attract objects to itself, right? And this is in so many words. There's again no allegory or no story or anything. It talks about it very explicitly. And so I think what it does is it reinforces the idea that our ancients in their texts knew about gravity and how to describe it. Now, I don't want to take Newton was a giant in physics, right? So he formulated the laws of motion. He tied it up together with the law of gravity, the equations for gravity, got the gravitational constant, and so on. But I just want to highlight the concept of gravity was known in ancient India, in some of the ancient Indian texts, and I thought that was quite a revelation for me.
Yeah, I mean, so we knew and we described gravity very clearly before the apple fell on the Englishman's head, right? So this is a myth that whether it fell on his head or not, but that's the story that has been always fed into it. If you're going to be taught stories in science, then might as well, So, but this is awesome, and so what I take away is that you differentiated so far about the Siddhantas and Puranas. So should we say that like Siddhantas were for ceremonies or aka scholars,
Scholars, yeah.
and Puranas were for the plebeians?
Very well said. I
So
think that's a very good separation to make, because the Siddhanta, if you look at the Surya Siddhanta, it has equations, right? And no ordinary person is interested, at least 2000 years ago, would have been interested in equations.
like
But
as if they're interested now.
yeah. But a scholar requires the precision. They don't require stories. They require the precision of the equation to be able to calculate precisely. Whereas the Puranas were for two things: were for a lay person, a non-scholar, to understand the world, number one. Number two, to be able to communicate it to other people who might be interested through the stories. So the Puranas contains both the science and the stories, through which they can be communicated out to a broader audience. So
for the common people, they could say like, okay, take it as 3. And for other people, like, hey, you need it in 99% accuracy if you're going to do anything with.
Very well said. So the Purana actually has a verse which says the diameter of something is X, right? It has a number, and then it says the circumference, or what is called the girth, is 3 times the diameter, right? And so for most people, it's good enough. It's like 95% accuracy. They're not going to be, they're not going to explore this a little more, but they leave it at that level. The Surya Siddhanta, it's very precise. It's just amazing the precision that you see in the Surya Siddhanta.
Awesome.
I was quite amazed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so let's, we have discussed pi, we have discussed gravity, things from school physics, but let's take it to a higher plane, you said that, you talk about in the book about a very beautiful Puranic story, right? About which you say is actually about time dilation, which actually is a concept from Einstein's theory of relativity. Purana, Einstein theory of relativity, time dilation. Kya bech rahe ho yaar?
So put yourself in my place when I'm reading the Puranas, and it just blows my socks off every time I read something like this, right? So let me start with the story. There's a very fascinating story of King Kakudmin and his daughter Revati. He has a very beautiful daughter called Revati, and he has to decide whom to marry her off to from a range of suitors, right? And he can't make up his mind, so he says he will take Brahma's advice for it. So he goes to Brahmaloka, and Brahmaloka is far away from the earth, right? The book actually describes it in some detail. And when he reaches Brahmaloka, he sees Brahma is enjoying a musical performance there. So it would be inappropriate to interrupt a musical performance, so he decides to wait. And Brahmanda Purana says he waited for 1 muhurta, right, for the performance to end. And when the performance ends, he goes to Brahma with folded hands and says, this is my beautiful daughter, and I'm not sure how to marry her off, right? There are so many suitors. Can you give me a suggestion? And Brahma laughs at him, and he says, in the 48 minutes that you waited with me, your entire kingdom, your race, your gotra, all your suitors and their races and their gotra and their kingdoms, everything has been wiped out. So don't even think about them anymore, right? In the 1 muhurta is 48 minutes, in the 48 minutes that you have waited here. So he said, in this muhurta, 27 Chatur Yugas have passed on the planet Earth.
That is the 48 minutes of Brahma.
Of Brahma, right? He's very explicit, right? Even though it's described in a story, the equating is very explicit. And he says, so let me give you some advice on what to do going forward. He says, go back to the earth, and you will find, he calls it a ray of Vishnu, Balarama, Krishna's brother, who's in the Mahabharata, and he says, marry Revati off to him, right? And then that will be that will be the right thing for you to do. So King Kakudmin and his daughter come back to earth, and as Brahma says, nobody has any recollection of them. Their kingdoms are lost, their palaces, everything has been gone. Nobody can recollect what they are talking about or what they are. So they go and introduce themselves to Balarama, and then the marriage takes place. So this is a phenomenal story, right? And this is not at all intuitive. And let me kind of make a point here. This is not like Jules Verne 100 years ago before submarines saying that, well, there's going to be submarines below the water. That's not what we are talking about, a concept that even after Einstein published it, few scientists were willing to accept it, right? That is how unintuitive it was. Basically, it says that time is a function of gravitation and it's a function of relative velocity. That's what time dilation says in the special theory of relativities. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but just to say that our GPS systems wouldn't work because the satellites are in space, which are in a region of low gravity and high speed, right? And so unless you correct for this delta in time, everything would go haywire. And so this is real. This is not made up. This is not just a scientific concept. And it is described in pretty amazing detail in two Puranas. It's also in the Bhagavata Purana and in the Brahmanda Purana. So it's quite interesting, the level of detail that's given here. I was quite amazed, actually.
So pause for a moment. Audience, please, type your questions in the Q&A section. So we look forward to that. And Ganesh would be able to take some questions. We would have some discussions on them. Back to our discussions, Ganesh, we are all familiar with the image of Shiva with, Ganga flowing through his matted hair. And, there's a discussion about the descent of celestial Ganga, right? And you talk about, say that this, what Puranic texts are talking about celestial Ganga is actually aligned with the modern science on the topic of extraterrestrial origins of water.
Yeah.
Okay, aliens or not, but you're saying that there is this water that we drink has extraterrestrial origins.
Right.
And so the image that we all see is not about a particular Indian river, but it's about how water came to Earth, right? That's what
and I actually
tell us more.
So this used to amaze me since I was a kid, right? I used to hear about the celestial Ganga, and we all know about the river that we all revere, right? Respect and revere, basically.
So where's the connection?
How is it something that can come from outer space and come to just this one river? It used to amaze me. But I just want to get something out of this. Puranas is very explicit. They say the celestial Ganga came down to earth and filled up the waters of the ocean. So it's not just the holy river, but that the celestial Ganga is responsible for the waters of the planet in general, right? So that's one thing I want to lay out there. The second thing I want to say is that the fact that the scientists accept that the water came from outer space is no longer in doubt. It's not just one of the theories out there. They have sent out 2 space missions just for this purpose, right? So there is the European Space Agency sent out what is called the Herschel mission about a decade ago, just to search for extraterrestrial sources of water. And they found enormous number of places where water can come from. Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail. And more recently, the Japanese Space Agency sent the Hayabusa mission, where they tried to get asteroid samples to check for this water and check for the water content in asteroids. So this is real, right? And so again, there is actual research that's being taken place around it, and so on. And so the current thinking is that the water, a lot of the water, not all the water, a lot of the water on the Earth's surface and the oceans and the rivers and so on, came from outer space in the form of either asteroids or comets. So an asteroid is largely space rock with a little bit of water in it, whereas a comet is largely space water, which is ice with a little bit of dust in it. So mirror images of each other. And these are seen as originating from a region around the planetary disk called either the Kuiper belt. The Kuiper belt is a ring of space around beyond Neptune, basically. Just think of it as, these are also called trans-Neptunian objects. So objects which are found beyond the orbit of Neptune. So that's the Kuiper belt, which is a large number of comets there. And then you have much further out is a 3-dimensional cloud called the Oort cloud, which surrounds the entire solar system. And again, you have a lot of comets that originate from the Oort cloud as well. So these are the 2 regions that are seen to be the origin of the water. Now, if you look at the story that you just talked about, you talk about the water being stored in Shiva's matted locks. Now, how did it get there? So it's again very explicit. It says that the Puranas say that the water came from beyond the Brahmanda, right? So billions of kilometers away from here. And then as they came in, one of the stories goes is King Bhagirathi, Ganga asks King Bhagirathi, if I come directly onto the planet, I will break the planet, right? And he prays to Shiva, and he asks Shiva to hold this water in an intermediate region of space. And that matches very well with either the Oort cloud or the Kuiper belt. So these seems to be this intermediate region of space where the celestial Ganga is held, from where it is released and then comes down to earth as water for the benefit of the planet. So there is a lot of detail around this. This is a very complex story because modern science only talks about its origin from the Kuiper belt or the Oort cloud. It doesn't talk about where it came from beyond this, or how the water came to be in this thing. And the Puranas actually have a view on it and where the waters originated from. And I find that I don't know whether it's true or false, because there is no science that we can compare it against, right? I just want to be very clear. We want to follow the scientific method. We, as a community of IITians, we want to, stay close to science. So I can't validate that, but it is amazing that ancients can even describe or even conceive of this level of detail in an ancient event like this. So I hope I was able to give you a sense. Maybe the readers that are interested can, read through it, and it kind of describes itself over a few chapters in terms of how this thing.
So they should buy your book and read it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so apart from the Ganga, the other thing that we grew up with, iconic thing is the Mount Meru.
Correct.
And you say that this is the North Pole.
Correct. Yeah.
And you say that they also, and you just now mentioned that from North Pole, the various continents and distances in an answer to a previous question. So and it's definitely, you talk about it in the book. So how are the various continents and their locations described in the Puranas with respect to to the the Mount Meru? Yeah.
Right. Good point you make. So like I said in an earlier slide, I said that they also talk about the Americas, North America and South America, right? So long before they were discovered. So I'm going to ask you to imagine, I'm going to ask the listeners to imagine, draw a line very approximately from Kanyakumari going up north all the way to the North Pole. And on the other side of the earth, roughly, it's not precise, going all the way down to the tip of South America. Right? Just imagine a region like that, right? A slice of the earth like that.
Yeah, it's like a thread around a ball, right?
A thread around the ball. Yeah, quite very well said. Nice analogy. So, and then the Puranas describe all the varshas of the continents in sequence. So the first one is the Bharata Varsha, then it's the Kimpurusha Varsha, then it's the Hari Varsha, then it's the Ilavrata Varsha, the Ramyaka Varsha, Hiranyaka Varsha, and then the Kuru Varsha. So you describe the entire range of continents from one side of the globe to the other side. And you can see that in the center, you have the Ilavrata Varsha, which has Mount Meru on it, right? It's described very clearly. So you can see from the sequence of continents, it has further descriptions about it as well. It talks about this is a region where the sun does not shine strongly. So you have to imagine that, we have especially in the equator, we have the overhead sun, or around the top, in the tropics, we have the overhead sun. Once you go to the North Pole, you just have the sun coming up the horizon during the day, and then it goes away for the night, right? For 6 months of the year. And so this is described very well. It says this is an area where the sun does not shine strongly, right? It describes that very clearly, the Ilavrata Varsha. And then it also says that so the Devas is described as the residents of Ilavrata Varsha, or specifically Mount Meru. And what it says is that a day of the Devas is equal to a year of the rest of the planet. So you can see if you're in the North Pole, if you're a resident of the North Pole or you're living on the North Pole, during the course of 1 year, you will see one sunrise and one sunset. So that means you will see essentially the whole of the year will be equivalent to a day physically, right? From your experience standpoint, but for somebody else elsewhere in the planet, it will be a full year. So I thought there was, these three things pointed specifically, but if you look at the rest of the description of the Earth, it becomes fairly obvious. And actually, if you talk to some of the scholars of the previous generation, like a parent or even grandparent if they are alive, they'll be very clear. They say, Mount Meru is the North Pole. They may not be able to articulate it very well in terms of why it is. So the book goes into a lot of detail in describing both the Earth's shape and size, but also on the various continents of the Earth.
Thanks, Ganesh. And you also talk about the various races of the people and their.
Yeah, that's very good. And that's what I'm glad you brought that up. That's why I was trying to say that it's not just this one thing. For example, it describes when I talked about the continents from Bharatavarsha, then above it is Kim Purusha Varsha. And Kim Purusha Varsha is by this formulation, is the Tibetan and the Chinese part of the planet. And it describes its residents as being of golden color, which is
right.
a good description of the Mongoloid people that are resident there. Beyond that, you have the Harivarsha, which is basically Caucasians that are living there on top. Beyond that, you have the Ilavrata, where we do not have a lot of people living. It doesn't describe, it basically describes the Devas. And then specifically about the Kim Purusha Varsha, it talks about the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan Desert, right? And Taklamakan Desert, these are the regions where the Lord does not shower any rain. So it talks about the deserts in the Kim Purusha Varsha. But very importantly, it talks about the underground rivers, channels of water in the Taklamakan Desert, which is a very unique feature to that part of the Earth. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it's found anywhere else in the planet. And so it kind of anchors that description of the Kim Purusha Varsha very well. So if you look at a lot of the data that is given and you put it all together, it's very explicit in terms of where they are coming to in the Puranas.
Right. So, Ganesh, there's one question which has come up in the Q&A, which is just related to, because we're talking about people and the races right now, and the description of the people. So one of the questions just related to that, and we'll take up other questions as we move along.
Yeah.
Is, do Puranas make reference to the creation and evolution of man or Homo sapiens? That's from Pradeep Menon.
The answer is yes. Right, so there is our current creation is called the creation of Marichi, or basically it evolved from Kashyapa, right? Kashyapa and Aditi. So there is a very elaborate description about the creation of men. Now, two things. First thing is, I was interested in cosmology, so I focused on cosmology, and I had an interest in cosmology from school, right? So I focused on cosmology. These are biological descriptions, right? And I don't claim to be, I have to study it. Maybe I'll get my head around it slowly. Mm-hmm. And I want to make sure that we have a good scientific explanation before I talk about it. And I couldn't find a good enough scientific explanation. I just want to leave it at that. But yes, there are elaborate descriptions about the origin of animals in the book. In the book, I talk about the origin of plants, which is very fascinating, and I don't want to get into it now unless there's a specific question. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot that there's given. There is an enormous wealth of detail. And it's like I was thinking about this. It's like you go into a forest to do an exploration. Suddenly you clear a few plants, and then you see one stone, and you see another stone, and it's like, my God, this is the whole city. And you realize that you can't understand this all by yourself. You need a whole team of people. Right? So I am trying to bring back to the audience here what I found as an individual, right? I'm sure there's a lot more people that can put their heads together and we can get to the bottom of this thing.
That's a very valid point, actually. Just to take a pause from the Q&A, right. What you have done with your research and writing the book is you have contributed to the conversation about it.
That's
And
it.
what you're now saying is that you're welcoming other people also
Absolutely.
to take up their own, research and, come and add to the conversation.
Absolutely.
And that's how this knowledge will grow, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said. Thank you very much for articulating that, Venkat. The Puranas are an ocean, right? And to say that one guy can go in and kind of figure it all is almost arrogant. So I don't want to leave anybody with that feeling. Right. But I think we now have a good enough framework that we can get our head around and say, yes, there is something of consequence here. Let's try and figure, maybe we can put more heads together and figure out what's going on here. Very well said.
So, of course, there's one more question, whether it's available on Indian Amazon. You already answered that. Yes, it is available, right? Okay, so let's come down to something a little more lighter stuff, and then we'll take up more questions from the from the Q&A, right? You have said a couple of times that Purana describe various cosmic phenomenon either factually or allegorically. Right. And one of the things that you have described is the story of the moon marrying 27 daughters of Daksha, etc., etc. So these are not stories about polygamy, right?
Let me clarify here. Very good question. So a lot of us are familiar with this story, right? Because there was a very popular television serial a couple of decades back, based on the Shiva Purana, which talked about, the son having 27 wives and spending all his time with one wife and, getting cursed for it. So this is 20 years ago. And I'm like, why would we have a story where, one person has 27 wives and spends all his time with one, even if that person is divine? Anyway, I said, well, maybe I don't understand it. I said, just move on. So there are other things to do. But there's a very very simple way of looking at it, right? So the moon orbits the Earth. The orbital cycle of the moon is 27.3 days. So it takes 27.3 days for the moon to orbit the Earth, right? And so the nearest whole number is 27, right? And so the nakshatra system of Indian, not just Puranas, the Indian nakshatra system of Indian astronomy is based around this 27 nakshatras. So basically, as it moves around the circle, just like the face of a clock is divided into 12 parts, the nakshatra system divides the movement of this moon into 27 different nakshatras. So the position for the moon on the sky is marked up against a specific nakshatra. It says, okay, each day it will be with a specific nakshatra and move on. So you can only look at the nakshatra and the moon at dawn, right? Because during the and you can see both of them or at night, yeah. So basically, because during the day, the moon, you can see neither the moon nor the stars. So every morning at dawn, you will see the moon rising up in the vicinity of one of the nakshatras, right? And it will go nakshatra by nakshatra for each of the 27 days of the lunar month. So you can say that if the moon early in the morning can be seen against a nakshatra, that means it, quote unquote, spent the night with that nakshatra. And if it spent the night with the nakshatra must be the wife. And if that nakshatra is the wife, then the moon married 27 wives. And so every day you see it again with a new nakshatra. So the moon has 27 wives and treats all its wives equally. But this is just the front end of the description of the moon. The story of the moon is the origin of the moon is a very complex phenomenon. And if some of the readers are interested in it, the Puranas have a very nuanced description and a phenomenally detailed description about this. And I'd urge them to kind of read it and share their thoughts. Like you said, it's a beginning of a conversation rather than definitive. And this is not something that even modern science has nailed completely. There are 2 or 3 hypotheses, and none of the hypotheses can explain all the data completely, right? So that's where we are right now. Yeah.
Right.
So hopefully we can do it.
So that point brings us to one of the questions out here. You have more than once you have said that the Puranas, especially the Brahmanda Purana, give a lot of details about the sun, the moon, the stars, and and so on and so forth. So one pointed question I have from Mr. Rathi, NK Rathi, is does this Purana, or maybe I can add that any other Purana, mention the dimensions of sun, earth, and details of space, space? Because I do remember we earlier having talked about that, they give those distances in yojanas and which are comparable and so on. And maybe you could, we had it in our private conversation earlier. So maybe this is a place where you can tell, Mr. Rati and the audience in general, how close these dimensional estimates were, in factors.
So good question, really good question. So there is a whole chapter on this in the book, right? But I'll try and summarize this as briefly as I can. So the first question, does it describe the diameter of the Earth? Yes, it describes the diameter of the Earth. You have to read it in a very nuanced fashion, but it describes it. And the book actually tells you how to compute it, right? So it shows you, and it's, I think, within a 10%, 10 to 15% accuracy, which I think is phenomenal for a text of this
a day and age, right?
A day and age. So that's one thing. It describes the distance to the moon, right? The Surya Siddhanta describes the distance to the moon. So I look at the Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas as one body of knowledge. They both coexist at the same time. The Surya Siddhanta for the scholars and the Puranas for the lay people, ordinary people.
Right.
And so between the two of them, they describe the distance of the moon, again within 15% or 10%, I can't recall specifically. They describe the diameter of the moon, again within 10 to 15%. They describe the distance to the sun, about 20%. So, and then because you have a unique situation where the sun and the moon have the same angular thing, which is why in a lunar eclipse or in a solar eclipse, the moon completely covers the disk of the sun. So if you know the dimension of the moon and the distance and the two distances, you can compute the distance of the sun, of the diameter of the sun. So there's a lot of detail that's available, that's there, and I encourage Mr. Rati to go in and do some more research of his own as well. I'm very glad that he's interested in this area, and I'm sure he can, I'm sure his inquiry will make some more contributions as well.
So those pretty close approximations, and this is given the fact that now what we had, the data that we have is with like radio telescopes and what have you, right? So those were like, we don't even know whether they had instruments to calculate it, or they had astronomical observations by which they use this, and so on and so forth. So yeah, we will take a few more questions from there, but one more thing, because one of the things that you did talk about in the book, but like many of us come across in our daily lives, and I think that's what I wanted to link it up, that we talk many of these things we talk about as if like this is very far and so on and so forth, and this is stories and so on. But one of the things that you brought up, and from that it alerted me to this, that hey, these are things that have been incorporated into our daily life, just that we are not conscious of it, right? In our prayers, religious ceremonies, for some people who may be more doing those daily nitya karma, daily prayers and so on and so forth, or even if you do periodically any prayer, any puja actually, and the priest will get it started with, or you start it with yourself, with something called a sankalpa, right? And or sometimes they don't mention it in a temple or elsewhere, but that it is. And you start with something mantras which go like this: Svetavaraha kalpe vaivasvata manmantare ashtavimsati tame pratame bhate. And then actually then they specifically mention about India too, like Jambu Dive, Bharatavarshe, Bharatakhande, Meroho, Dakshine Parse. So now you just spoke about Meru and then south of it, right? And then it goes on to Asmin Vartamane Vyavaharike Prabhavadi Sashti Samvatsaranam Matye. So it goes on to like right now, right? For some of the words that I'm picking up from there. So tell us, so are these connecting us? Like our prayers, we start with a scale of time of billions of years. If I connect all the dots, which you have now laid out, and then they bring us to this moment in time, every time we do a prayer?
Good question. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Good question there. Let me back up a little bit. The word sankalpa means resolve or determination, right? So basically, instead of just saying, I just said a mantra or a shloka or something, You start by saying, I resolve to carry out this ritual or this function or this shloka at this time, at this place, right? Makes sense, right? And you think that, okay, this time probably means calendar time, and if it's not the Gregorian calendar, it's probably Vikramaditya calendar or something. You realize when you read this thing, it is actually talking about time from the beginning of creation, of the beginning of the life of Brahma. So let me give you an example. So it starts with Sweta Varaha Kalpe. So the Sweta Varaha Kalpa is about 1.95 or 1.97 billion years old, right? And I'm not making it up. Anybody can go in and open a Purana and do like middle school arithmetic, right? So it's not very complicated stuff. So it starts with Sweta Varaha Kalpe. And then it says Dvitiya Parardhe, which means the second half of the life of Brahma, the first Kalpa in the second half of the life of Brahma. And the life of Brahma is in trillions of years. I don't want to get into that. It's a whole different discussion in itself. Then it says the Vaivasvata Manvantara, because there are, this is the seventh Manvantara in this Kalpa. Each Manvantara is about 300 million years. So 6 of them will be 1.8 million years, 1.8 billion years. And then this is the Kali Yuga. This is the 28th Chatur Yuga.
Ashtavimshati, right?
Ashtavimshati, this is the 28th Chatur Yuga. It is the Kali Yuga of the 28th Chatur Yuga, the Kali Yuga. Then the first quarter of that Kali Yuga, Prathame Pathe.
Right.
And you kind of wonder, what's going on here? So basically, and then they go down to the year, so many, and then the month, and then the year, the ayana, the ritu, the month, the week, the day of the week, the tithi, and it is just amazing. That means basically what they've done is they've taken the entire system of calendaring and put it into the beginning of a sankalpa so that it's never forgotten. Right? You may not realize you're saying it, but you keep saying it over and over again, so that imagine 2000 years ago, somebody was saying the exact same sankalpa, only with on a different time.
Last portion changed.
Last portion changed, right? And that's a mind-altering thought, right? When you kind of think of it.
Yeah. So that sounds to me like a universal date and time stamp, right?
Absolutely.
And more personalized on the prayer as to you add your location, right?
Correct.
South of the North Pole, Mount Meru. I'm in India and I'm doing this prayer, and Vindhyasya Uttare, north. Or if you're in Singapore, then we say Simhapuri Dvipe, and you modify and so on and so. So like absolute sort of date, time, place stamp on it.
Yeah, and let me add one more thing here. So yes, it's a date time stamp. And it starts from the beginning, not only of the current kalpa. Every kalpa is a cycle of creation, right? So when the kalpa ends, basically everything ends. So all the Puranic stories are contained inside a kalpa, right? There is very little knowledge of a prior kalpa. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 shloka that you can find of an older kalpa, that's it, right? Very little knowledge of a prior kalpa. This talks about the beginning of the life of Brahma. So 50 years of Brahma's life before that. And then, and I was thinking about this once, and I thought, we have our dharma, right? We have our duties, we have our responsibilities, and we take them seriously, and we do what we do to take care of our families, our loved ones, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we are individuals, right? One of billions of people in a universe that has lasted for a couple of billion years or trillions of years. And I think what it does, I thought for me, right, what it does philosophically is that it puts me in some kind of perspective in terms of this overall cosmic activity, right? And we still have to do what we have to do, because that's our dharma. But I think we should step a little lightly and take ourselves a little slightly less seriously, and that will serve us probably well as we kind of deal with the ups and downs of life. So
so very, very well said. That I also feel that like it making it part of everyday prayer, that kind of reminds you that do good to your family, to your society, etc. But don't get too carried away about your noble actions, because in the great cycle of time, this is just a tiny moment and a tiny act in the whole universe. It's kind of a humbling reminder.
Very humbling, very well said, very well. And I take that away, and the book doesn't talk about philosophy, but I think if there's any philosophy, this is one piece that kind of jumped across to me, and I said, okay, I know my place in the universe. That doesn't mean I have to do anything less. I have to work less hard or anything, but it's nice to know that life will go on one way or the other. So
Right,
good
awesome.
point.
So there are lots of questions, and we will take some more. So some more questions from the audience, and but that's a sort of a good humbling thought to end our discussions and move on to take. Yeah. So one of the things is I'm not sure. Like, I didn't see this in your book, but there's a question about avatar of Lord Sarbeshwara.
Yes.
Is substantiated. So reference to the Sarpas mean that we feel the avatar of Lord Sarbeshwara is substantiated. I believe. Will you agree? Is one of the questions from Lakshmi Kantan.
Yes, it is actually. It is very well substantiated. Actually, the book also writes about it. It's a very small piece, just a couple of paragraphs. It talks about the Lord Sarbeshwara, and it's a whole discussion. I mean, it's 2 or 3 paragraphs that gives a lot of detail behind it. But the question is very valid, and it's absolutely right. The book validates that in some detail. And this is an avatar of Lord Shiva that's been lost for all practical purposes. If you talk to it, if you actually even talk to me, I would not know about it, in spite of having temples to the Lord Sarveshwara in a few places in the south. But it's not very well. But it's mentioned very clearly in the Puranas, and I draw a linkage between that and what the mythic. The translation of the saraba, of the animal saraba, is that it's always translated as a mythical animal. So the attempt in the book has been to translate that myth and what it must be. I mean, I want to leave that to a reader right now. I don't want to get into more detail.
Okay.
Very valid question.
Right. So there have been quite a few people, who have asked this question about, like, did you really read the Puranas? Right. I mean, you don't look that Purana. So people are wondering, like, whether you really read the Purana, right? Like, so ye kya bol kya raha hai ye? So anyway, so you can tell us, like, what Puranas and where do you get them, and then maybe you can throw in about Motilal Banarsi Das. Then they'll say, "Ah, theek hai, ye kuch padha likha hai." Right. Like after we got our degrees, then only our family started saying, "Ha, kuch padha likha hai ye." Right? So like that, thoda sa. But before that, I wanted to. Interestingly, this question has come from a youngster, a student of mine, which then I think you can answer both of these things relatively.
Wonderful.
So I'll put that question, and then you combine it with the other questions.
Okay.
So what are the differences? And I know that you talk about it in your book. The main differences between Puranas, Vedas, and Upanishads.
Okay.
And like and then how do they correlate with modern science, and why did you choose on Puranas only? And then, like, other people have asked that, like, hey, which Puranas did you really read?
Okay.
Right.
So this is so let me break up this question. There's a lot that's going on in a couple of places.
Yeah, I also clubbed. To be fair, they didn't ask a long question, but I thought they were all context.
Yeah, they were. So they're part of the count. So a couple of things. First thing is that we have if you look at what we generally consider as the corpus of text, right? They are basically 3. There's the Shruti, which is the Vedas. There is the Smriti, which is the Puranas, and then there is the Itihasa, which is history, right? Which is basically Mahabharata and Ramayana. So these are the 3 big bodies. There's, of course, Brahmanas. This is a whole body of work, right? So I'm just taking a subset of this entire body of work. This is the most probably visible body of work to a lot of us. So the Vedas are Shruti, which means they are heard, right? The Puranas are Smriti. And it is surprising that some of these events are described as Smriti means something that you've experienced. How do you experience the life cycle of the sun, right? So that's the first thing that kind of jumped up to me, is like, that doesn't make sense. But anyway, let me put that aside. Let me first find out what's going on here. And then you have the Itihasa, which is the history itself. Now, the Upanishad is a subordinate text to the Vedas. So Nishada means feet, to mean it sits at the feet of the Vedas, right? And so the Upanishads are commentaries of the Vedas.
Guru or somebody.
That you learn more about the Vedas. Right? Because the Vedas are a very complex text. The Puranas are described by the Puranas as being science. Okay, so there's a verse in the Padma Purana which says that the Veda, when they say Veda, they mean the entire text got given by Vishnu to Lord Brahma, and then it says the Purana became the source of all the sciences. So it actually talks about Puranas in the context of science. Right? I should have maybe mentioned that earlier on. So the Puranas have a lot of science, right? It's just that, for example, it has astrology. It has astrology and astronomy. Now we look at Indian. We don't realize that Indian astronomy is very rich, very, very rich. Let me give you an example. So today, when we predict an eclipse, we use fancy computers to run, it's going to be visible here at this date, at this time, from this time, so on and so forth, right? Maybe with NASA's help. What did we do 100 years ago before there was NASA? We used to do this manually. Manually. Not even a computer, right? We used to do it manually in India, and they would predict which parts of the world you could see the eclipse in. How was this known, right? So there's a lot of astronomy that was known from then. Only the thing is, it got also the more visible part of it was astrology, which is a very subjective thing, right? It's like management science, right? And so different people have different opinions on it, and because everything got clubbed up together, and they said, oh, it's not a science, and so the astronomy also got thrown away with it. So there is very good astronomical science, which I honestly don't understand fully because I'm not a student of astronomy. I hope to be at some point in time, which talks about the science of astronomy. And there's the science of music, the science of medicine. There's such a lot of science in the Puranas, it is amazing. In terms of how did I start reading it, it's a very, very interesting story. I was actually talking to a friend. I don't know if he's on the call right now. He said he might join. And he told me that he was reading a book on the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know if many of you have heard of that book. It's a story, one of the sub-stories of the Epic of. It's an Egyptian story, Egyptian text. One of the sub-stories is about the Great Flood. There's a story description of the Great Flood in it. And he said he was going to read it, and I said, "Oh, Matsya Purana also," without ever having read it. So anyway, he said he's going to read it. I said I'll start reading the Matsya Purana, and I bought myself the Matsya Purana. I mean, I had now committed myself to it, right, to a friend. And I found it absolutely fascinating. So I read the Matsya Purana. After that, I read the Shiva Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, the Brahmanda Purana, the Kalika Purana, the Devi Purana, and I'm halfway through the Markandeya Purana. So I've read all of these end to end, and I have researched the others, right? For example, if I want to know about the story of the sun or the story of the moon, I go into the Padma Purana and find out all the stories of the sun. So I haven't read the whole of the Padma Purana or the Skanda Purana, but I go and read specific parts of it. So
and yes, you read them in English, right?
I read all of them in English. Thank you.
So the English translations of
there are English translations. And so the government of India in 1950s, what it did was it sponsored a board of scholars, right? So these were scholars of Sanskrit scholars and scholars in various fields to go and start translating the Puranas, right? And so this is a solid body of work. It was, like you said, published by Motilal Banarsi Das. But most people don't read it. So it's completely out of print. Nobody bothers to read them anymore. So it's out of print. And so after the first 2 or 3 Puranas, I had to download the Purana from the internet and print the whole thing end to end and then read it, because I was fascinated. Right? I just thought it was probably the best way to spend my time and money. Mm-hmm. So I printed a lot of these things, read them, and then came to the conclusions that I did. So yeah, I read a lot, and I don't think I'm done. I would like to read some more.
Okay, so Purana meets HP printers. Okay,
yeah.
so there's another question which is very interesting. Is there work going on right now? To
validate
use the question words from the question, leaning on the Puranas to develop new or alternative hypothesis. Who is doing that?
My guess is not. Because because every time I talk about this to an audience, they are surprised. And I'm talking to IIT-ians here. I talk to scholars, right? People who have been in academia for a long period of time. They see this and they're like, what's going on here? I can't believe what's going on. So I can't imagine that it is the source of hypothesis. At the end of the day, for it to be science, it has to become a hypothesis. Then you
Right.
test that hypothesis and validate or invalidate it. I don't think it's gone to that phase. Hopefully, as this discussion gains momentum, maybe it gets to more people, and what has been suggested is likely to happen.
So you mentioned that you downloaded some of the Puranas from modern internet, right? Not so Purana printout. So there's a question from Mr. Sengupta. Udayan Sengupta is asking like, Surya Siddhanta, where do we get it from, or is it available on the internet?
Actually, instead of just making a generic statement, there's a website called archive.org. And I recommend people to go to that site.
I repeat, archive.org. Yeah, org, yeah.
It is a treasure. It's an absolute treasure, right? And these people do it for free. So if there are some very wealthy contributors, just help them, because you will find practically every single ancient Indian text in digital form in this website. And it's run out of the US, and I contribute once in a while as I can, but it's like Wikipedia. It just runs on public funds, right? People just contribute. There's no government funding, no sponsors, no advertising, no nothing. It's an amazing site. And I'd strongly recommend people going in, and you'd be amazed at what you can find there.
Right. So there's also something that I think we had not put in our main questions for discussion. That question has come up here. So about pole star, the Dhruvatara, and the precision, with which they had this. So we had talked about, you have in your book, you're talking about the precision calculations. So you have something to comment on this?
I'm not sure I followed the question.
So the question is about Dhruvatara, pole star, and the precision with which some of these calculations.
Okay. So I got confused.
What's your take on this? Yeah.
I got confused with precision and precession, which is the movement of.
Sorry. My mistake. Precession. Sorry. I read it wrongly. Switching between toggling between the questions and the screen. I made Precession.
Okay.
My apologies.
So I have not. So I'm not a student of astronomy, right? So I didn't want to say this. I know that there is a precession of the Earth. The Puranas talk about, in the various stages, it talks about different gods and so on and so forth. But I have not been able to find more specific references to precession. And maybe I have to do some more work around this, but not in the Puranas. I have not yet been able to find. But I would hazard a guess that it probably is there, because the amount of detail. I'll give you an example, right? The shape of the Earth is not very clearly delineated in the Puranas. It's not, right?
Okay.
Right? I'm going to give you just a very personal experience. And then I'm going through this thing and I'm thinking, so the Puranas talk about the sun, they talk about the moon. How is it that they have no clue about the planet Earth that we all live on? I mean, it just doesn't add up, right? It doesn't make any sense. So what I had to do was I had to print out references to the Earth in Matsya Purana, in Brahmanda Purana, 3 or 4, and I would read it over and over and over again for a few, because it wasn't obvious to me, right? And then suddenly I said, okay, now I understand what's going on here. And so similarly, some amount of work, probably if what somebody else does, or maybe I can do it myself, I'm sure we will understand the precession. At this stage, it's not obvious. Yeah. So good question. I just don't have an answer yet.
Right. So there's some, more, I mean, when you have IITians and, people of similar background, there are some high funda questions also from IITians and non-IITians. So are there things like dark matter, string theory? I don't know. In the Puranas, did you come across any of those things?
So let me say, there is a lot in the Puranas that we don't understand.
Okay.
There is a lot in modern science that we don't understand.
Okay.
Are these two the same? I have no idea.
Right.
So at this stage, without evidence, to hazard a guess would be almost irresponsible to my mind. Right? But so maybe I'd leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't be more conclusive than that. Maybe.
Right. So you described, when you scared everybody off, when you talked about the sun expanding and, Earth coming closer to the sun, etc. So there are a couple of questions. Is Vinasha sure to happen when sun comes closer to the Earth? But I mean, 2020 में इतने डर गए, we are scared of 2020, but like just assure us that this is not anywhere nearby, right?
We are at least 5 billion, 3 to 5 billion years away from that. So it's a little further out in time.
So we can relax for a little time, right? Okay, cool. So I know we've taken a lot of time. There are awesome questions. Yeah. So is there a scientific parallel to the concept of 14 lokas? On the one hand, we have this question, and on the other hand, people are like in modern science fiction, Inception, Matrix. Are there comparisons? So
let's start with the lokas.
I leave it with you between lokas and Inception, and you cover everything in between.
So a couple of things. First thing is, let's start with the lokas. The lokas is very material, right? I mean, you can kind of, you can talk of their physics, they are physical, unlike Inception, which happens in somebody's dreams, inside somebody's dreams, and so on, right? I was actually very fascinated by what I discovered about the lokas, right? And so first thing is, there are two sets of lokas, the 14 lokas. There are 7 deva lokas and 7 patala lokas. The 7 deva lokas are basically the 7 lokas above the surface are the Bhuloka, Bhorloka, Swarloka, Janloka, Maharloka, Tapaloka, and Brahmaloka. Right. So this is the sequence that we have. The Puranas talk about the Dhruva Tara as at the top of the celestial regions, which means the top of Swargaloka. That means beyond Swargaloka, you have the Janloka, Mahaloka, and Tapaloka. What is fascinating is this. Right, about this description. It says that the regions of especially Janaloka and Tapaloka are untouched by the sun when it dies. Now, you might think, or it describes it as the souls are, they live through a kalpa. Sorry, let me kind of rephrase that. It says it lives through a kalpa, and this kalpa is the death of the sun. So basically, these are whatever is in this area is untouched when the sun dies, collapses, right? Basically becomes a white dwarf and it collapses. And these, if you look at the actual distance, they are just outside what is called the gravitational influence of the sun. That means if anything were to happen, if the sun were to collapse, there would be little or no influence in these areas. So it could be a coincidence, I don't know, right? But it seems to be an amazing coincidence if there's a coincidence. And then it talks about the Janloka and the Tapaloka in this fashion, and then is the Brahmaloka, which is the region of Brahma, which is where we talked about time dilation and so on. So it's useful to talk when you look at in science, you look at these areas. So when I'm saying it doesn't, it's basically what it says is that the gravitational force of the sun is balanced out by the gravitational force of the surrounding stars. So basically, the net gravitational force is 0 at that point in time. Yeah? We think of space, near space, which is just about 20, 30 kilometers, 100 kilometers from here as having 0 gravity. It's not. It has gravity. There's the gravity of the Earth, there's the gravity of the sun, the moon, and so on. You really have to go that far out into space to get into 0 gravity. So that's one. So the book talks about it in some sense. And actually, since I've written the book, I have discovered a lot more, and I don't know if there will be an opportunity to update the book and talk about that. But what is really interesting is about the Padala Loka, right? It is we have a perception of what the space is, right? The lokas above us. None of us has any clue. Actually, I had no clue about Padala. I used to keep looking at, it's probably a deep hole in the ground or something, or a dark place or hot place or something like that. And there's a lot of analysis in the book that goes into that. I think I thought it was a good, fun read, that part of the analysis. I realize we are almost 1.5 hours into this discussion, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail. But
not to Patala Loka, right? But trust me, I've read his book. Trust me, there's a lot of description of Patala Loka. Not too scary. So, but
I'm not scared. It's actually quite fun.
But they're pretty parallel to this thing.
Yeah.
So this is not any stories of mythology and to scare off kids in the night. So there have been quite a few questions again. Availability of the book on Amazon. It is available. Amazon Ganesh ebook also is available. A Kindle
Kindle
reader
is
is
also
available.
available.
So Kindle version is also available for those in Singapore. Hugs Epigram Cafe in URA building will have the print copies, but yeah, so choose your versions to read. So quite a few people have asked. English versions of Puranas are available on archive.org or org. So I know it's 90 minutes. So one interesting question. I know there are lots of questions. I'm going to be sort of like, some people may be upset that I'm missing some questions, but you mentioned Puranas at the opening that they talk about testing. So Ajit Da from Singapore has this question: are there testing protocols in Purana? तुम यार बच के नहीं जाओगे यहाँ से ऐसे.
This is a hardcore audience.
Yeah.
No. So there is a whole. Let me back up a bit. There is a whole school of what is called epistemology, of how to approach knowledge, right? So when you say testing, you're testing for knowledge, not testing for internet protocols or printer software or things like that. You're testing for how do you approach knowledge in general. And few of us realize that India has a phenomenally well-developed sense of this. Phenomenally well-developed. I'd refer to a series of podcasts called The History of Indian Philosophy. It's available on Apple, and I'm sure it's available on Google as well. It's by Janardhan Ganeri. And it talks about the richness of philosophy and some of it is Buddhist and some of it is Hindu and so on. So all the sides have contributed to it. But there is an incredible amount of richness in this. And so it not only approaches what is knowledge, but how do you validate a knowledge? How do you understand what is knowledge? And so it has its own sets of rules on what constitutes knowledge. And to my mind, that is a testing protocol, right? You want to test for whether what you are being exposed to is real or is made up, basically. So it has it at that level. I don't know it has it at any different level. So very good question, I thought. I'm glad you brought that up.
Right. So, once again, we're thankful to our sponsors, ICICI Bank Limited, Optimum Solutions Limited, who are gold sponsors, silver sponsors, HDFC, Hugs, Epigram, Strategile, Agrud, for supporting this event as well as other events. I know we are at crossed the 90-minute mark. So and there's still a lot of fascinating questions. Maybe we could, compile and send them to Ganesh. But thank you, Ganesh, for taking time out and sharing your insights from both your research as well as interesting gems from your book, From the Beginning of Time, Modern Science and Puranic Universe. Your passion for the subject came out in the discussions in the Q&A. So though we covered the sun, moon and the stars, from nanometer to light years and fraction of a millisecond to billions of years, friends, there is much more to these things, than these actually in Ganesh's book, as you could see some of those things which we could bring it up in the your Q&A, but there's a lot more that we could than what we could cover in 90 minutes. So I'll encourage all those interested to buy this book and read it, and more so, like Ganesh himself says, read the Puranas themselves also and contribute to the discussions. So we have an awesome audience in you. So and you can see how it aligns with modern astronomy, other fields of science, and so on. So, Ganesh.
No, I first off, to you, Venkat, thanks for taking the time to read the book, right? I mean, for you, it was okay, this is another book.
No.
You took the time to read it, to kind of get into the guts of the book and frame the questions that you did. Thanks to the IIT Alumni Association, and thanks to the audience, because I realize I'm speaking to a hardcore audience, like you said.
Yeah, IIT-ians and the association was very nice to throw it open to everybody. So we have got a lot of intellectual people and interested people, bringing some of them probably are with families.
And I think if we can crowdsource some of the thinking around this, right? I don't think this is what I want to do is to just kind of give a glimpse of what all it contains. And if we can crowdsource this and also have some sense of, make sure that, Unless you're careful, you can run off in 20 different directions and not have any core.
Sure.
But
sure.
if you can have some discipline around it, I'm sure between us, and not just myself, but between the larger community, I think we can rediscover the depth of this treasure of knowledge that we have. I'm convinced, and I think it'll. And it's not. I mean, it's not just an Indian thing. Knowledge is knowledge. It benefits everybody across the world, across religions, across faiths, across geography. So, thanks again to you, Venkat. Thanks again to IIT Alumni Association.
No, like you said, thanks to the great audience here. Thank you all for joining. Without you all, like this event would not have been possible at all, right? So please stay connected for future high quality events like this. So you had an experience from IIT Alumni Association Singapore. Thanks to the IIT Exco, especially the events team led by Krish and others. You guys have been absolutely awesome. So till next time, this is Venkat signing off. Thank you, everyone.